On the 6th of February, another Security Council meeting was held in New York at the request of the Russian Federation to talk about the situation in Ukraine. Now, Russia keeps doing that. It keeps using its right to request for council meetings in order to discuss the war over and over and over again. And the Western powers are quite annoyed at this, because this is one of the moments when Russia really has the power to force the war on the diplomatic agenda, which of course undermines the West's talking point that Russia is not interested in diplomacy. The opposite is true. Russia tries the entire time to use all diplomatic means it has, while it also keeps saying that it will continue using its military force, which is literally what the Russian representative this time even said. But they're doing both, a dual track approach, in order to get where they want to go. And I would like to share that with you, because these meetings are the one moment when all the great powers and, the little vegetables around, like the other non-big powers, the ones without much to say, get to talk in the Security Council. It's 15 members, right? And everybody can express themselves, and there's very clear rules of procedure, which is why it goes back and forth. And I will be showing you now the exchange that happened between the Russian representative first, and then I will skip a few people, and we will listen to the French representative and then to the UK representative, which both gave their usual reply, because you know how the memo has gone around to everybody, saying that whenever the Russians say something, just keep claiming that nothing would ever have happened, nothing bad would have happened, and nobody would have died if Russia had never invaded. That's the mantra at the moment that everybody repeats, because under international humanitarian law, it doesn't matter who starts a war or what starts a war once a war takes place, or armed conflict is actually what humanitarian law talks about. Once armed conflict is taking place, the laws of war or international humanitarian law starts applying, and it is illegal to kill civilians. It is illegal to bomb civilian infrastructure. All of these things are declared illegal, and Russia keeps bringing this up because we keep having these tragedies, which of course happen. Actually, they do happen on both sides. But recently, we've seen this one here on Saturday. 28 people were killed in a strike that CNN reports on like this, and I just want to point your attention to this one. CNN reports at least 28 killed in strike on Russian-occupied town in eastern Ukraine. Makes you almost think that the Russians killed these people, although that's not what the article or the title says. You have to scroll far down to realize that the Russians are actually accusing the Ukrainians of having done that, and the Ukrainians are silent about it. It's also very telling that this happened on Saturday, the 3rd of February. Takes CNN 2 full days until Monday to actually report about it. And then it took the Russians really only 3-4 days to actually get this on the agenda, because this was then discussed here on the 2nd of February in the Security Council. So basically, in reply to that, even Western mainstream media was forced to kind of acknowledge that something happened. This was what they wanted to talk about, and the Russians do this over and over. So now, please, without further ado, enjoy the exchange. I will give a couple of more remarks after everything. Please have a look.
Madam President, we have convened an urgent meeting of the Security Council in connection with the missile attack carried out by the armed forces of Ukraine on the town of Lysychansk on Saturday, February 3rd. As a result of the attack, the 2-story building of a cafe and bakery was almost fully destroyed, and the ceilings between the floors collapsed. Approximately 40 people were buried under the rubble. 28 people died, including a pregnant woman and her 5-year-old child. 4 of the injured are still in very serious condition. We have no doubt that the target and the timing of the attack were not chosen by chance. The city is located close to the line of contact between the two sides and is regularly shelled using a variety of weapons. There are a few recreational facilities there. The neo-Nazis deliberately waited until families were out for a walk on their day off and cynically attacked what is practically the only place of leisure in Lysychansk. The strike was carried out using high-power explosive, high-precision weapons, presumably HIMARS MLRS rockets were used. The investigative committee of the Russian Federation has already seized fragments of ammunition from the site of the attack and is verifying their provenance. Today, we are certain to hear claims that Russia convenes the Council too often on aspects of the Ukrainian crisis. But it is not us coming up with the reasons for these meetings. It is the Ukrainian militants who have become so savage and brazen that they are committing terrorist acts nearly every week, shelling civilian infrastructure and killing civilians on Russian territory. This is the fourth terrorist attack of this kind in the past month and a half. The actions of the Kiev regime are astonishing in their cruelty and their sophisticated hatred. The shelling in Belgorod, the 2 strikes on Donetsk, and now the one in the city of Lysychansk took place on weekends and public holidays in areas where civilians congregate in large numbers. And the timing of the strike invariably coincided with peak numbers of visitors at a particular site. In none of the cases was there any military infrastructure nearby. The fact that the junta's Kiev has finally cast off its masks and chosen the path of terrorism is evidenced not only by the frank statements of its ringleaders, but also by the actions that they are taking. For example, yesterday we learned that Georgian border guards confiscated a batch of explosives disguised as car batteries and intended for terrorist attacks in Voronezh and possibly Tbilisi. This failed action, which inter alia was aimed at blaming Georgia for everything, is the responsibility of a member of parliament from Zelensky's party. And it is these projects and the style of the most egregious ISIL terrorists that are being funded by Western aid for Ukraine. The Ukrainian armed forces undoubtedly have a sense of impunity and all-permissiveness. What's more, they're aware of the unconditional support from Washington, London, and Brussels, who do not care about the killing of civilians, the destruction of families and people's lives and futures. In its blind hatred for our country and its desire to somehow weaken Russia, the West is prepared to pay with other people's lives and to renounce universal norms of morality. One hopes that the ordinary citizens of the United States and the European Union who live under brutal censorship and propaganda will hear the whole truth about Kiev's atrocities and the complicity of their own governments in them. They should know that the lethal weapons regularly being sent to Ukraine are used to commit terrorist acts against innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure in violation of international humanitarian law. If someone tries to argue that Western countries have nothing to do with this because it is Kiev that chooses its own targets for its strikes, they should be reminded of the confession made by Mr. Skibitsky, a representative of the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine. In August 2022, he let slip that in order to use HIMARS systems, Kiev needs to agree on the target with Washington ahead of time. So that's clear who was an accomplice to the crime committed in Lysychansk. And not just this crime, but dozens, if not hundreds, of others involving Western weapons. Madam President, among such recent heinous crimes of the Banderite junta is the January 24th premeditated attack on the Russian military transport aircraft Il-76 of the Russian armed forces, which was carrying 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war for an agreed exchange. As a result of this attack, 74 people were killed, including the Russian crew, military, police officers, and all the prisoners of war. I recall that the Kiev regime was perfectly aware of the planned exchange, and it was duly informed about the mode of transportation being used and the route by which the prisoners would be transported. Yet almost immediately after the plane crash, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine triumphantly confirmed its involvement, thus de facto recognizing that the aircraft had been shot down by the valiant Ukrainian military on purpose. Yet, as soon as the public learned that the plane was transporting captured Ukrainian soldiers to their place of exchange, President Zelensky's office radically changed its talking points and began to cowardly deny any involvement of Ukraine in the disaster. It is telling that President Zelensky initially stated the need for an international investigation into the deaths of those aboard the aircraft. However, as more and more evidence of the Ukrainian armed forces' involvement emerged, the Kyiv regime abandoned this demand as it realized that involving unbiased international experts in the investigation could confirm its guilt and fully destroy Ukraine's already tarnished reputation. Since the meeting we requested on January 25th, the Russian investigation has progressed. We have completed the decoding of the flight data recorder and the voice recorder. We also analyzed washes from fragments of hulls and mechanisms from the crash site and identified traces of hexogen with impurities containing up to 10% of octogens, which is typical for foreign-made explosives. Today, we possess irrefutable evidence that a Patriot surface-to-air missile was used to carry out the strike, which leaves no doubt that Washington is a direct accomplice in this crime as well. The State Department has not commented on this information in any way. Instead, it has hypocritically suggested that Kyiv's representatives do so. More than 670 fragments of victims' bodies, as well as partially preserved personal documents, were found and collected near the crash site. As a result of the genetic tests that were carried out, we can unequivocally confirm the identity of the 6 crew members, 3 military police officers, and 65 Ukrainian servicemen who died when the plane crashed. The investigation had the genetic data of all the Ukrainian soldiers at its disposal, and we are prepared to share the outcome of our national investigation with any interested international organizations. We have already circulated a letter to this effect to the United Nations. The evidence of the Ukraine armed forces' involvement in this terrorist attack on the Il-76 is so irrefutable that even the West cannot ignore it. An unnamed French official recently told the Associated Press that the French military believes that the plane was shot down by a Patriot system from a distance of about 50 kilometers. We once again call on the members of the Security Council and the leadership of the United Nations to decisively condemn the rocket attack on Lysychansk, as well as all other terrorist acts committed by the Kyiv regime. The Banderite junta sees your silence as a carte blanche to commit ever more crimes. For our part, we reaffirm that all those involved in these crimes, including their organizers and the executors, will be identified and held accountable. We also reaffirm that all the objectives set for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, as well as the other goals set for the special military operation, will be achieved, whether by diplomatic or military means. Thank you.
Madam President, I would like to thank Madame De Carlo for her briefing. On the 1st of February, an NGO convoy of EPER, Swiss Protestant Mutual Assistance, was chased by Russian drones as it was coming out of the town of Berislav. The 2 vehicles were non-armored vehicles, and they were displaying the logo of EPER on the bonnet and on the sides of the vehicles. It was impossible to ignore that these were vehicles belonging to an NGO. Russia deliberately targeted this convoy, killing 2 French civilian aid workers and injuring 3 others, as well as a Ukrainian. These individuals were humanitarian workers. They were risking their lives to come to the aid of the Ukrainian population, which for 2 years now has been suffering from the devastating consequences of the Russian aggression. Russia once again has deliberately targeted civilians, violating international humanitarian law. Just last week, it attacked Ukraine more than 1,500 times, hitting 570 towns and villages, killing 12 and wounding 60. We will not forget either the massacres committed by the Russian forces in Ukraine, the targeting of the train station of Kramatorsk as thousands of civilians were trying to flee the conflict, the shopping center of Kremenchuk, the residential buildings of Vinnytsia, and the funeral reception in Roja. The cynicism with which Russia is trying to turn the tables of responsibility escapes no one. By convening the meeting today, whilst they are targeting on a daily basis civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, Russia is insulting our intelligence. It is once again crudely manipulating this council. Russian soldiers and inhabitants of Donbass, civilians throughout the villages of Ukraine, French first aid workers, Russia bears it alone the responsibility for all of these deaths in its war against Ukraine. France presents its condolences to the families of the 28 innocent victims of the 3rd of February, but that kind of drama, just as all of the others, did not happen before the 24th of January 2022. Russia must cease its aggression and withdraw its troops, as the International Court of Justice has asked them to do. And if it did that, the carnage would cease. It can make that choice at any time without harming its own security or that of the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to Under-Secretary General De Carlo for your briefing. And we welcome the representative of Ukraine to the Chamber for this meeting. The UK deeply regrets all loss of life in this war wherever it occurs. But perhaps we should start with a few facts which Russia tries to hide from the world and from its own people. In the 700 days since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine began, many, many thousands of people have been killed or injured at the hands of Russian forces. Russia has carried out relentless attacks on civilian infrastructure, homes, schools, hospitals, and places of worship. Russian forces are reported to be responsible for large-scale atrocities, including torture, sexual violence, forced deportations, and summary executions. In the process, staggering numbers of Russian soldiers have themselves been killed, and Russian families bereaved. It is the Russian government alone that is responsible for the death and suffering caused by this war. No amount of disinformation can obscure the very basic fact that it was Russia who invaded Ukraine, unprovoked and in clear violation of the UN Charter. It is a war that President Putin refuses to end, despite all the damage that it has done to Russia's standing in the world, and despite the enormous numbers of Russian men and women who have been killed. He has instead chosen to double down on an imperialist fantasy. Russian strikes continue to rain down on Ukraine using weapons procured from Kim Jong-un in violation of Security Council resolutions. So when Russia comes to this council intent on disseminating their propaganda, let us instead all remember who is responsible for this war and its terrible human cost. Who continues to trample all over the principles of this organisation, and who has the power immediately to bring this war to an end. And when Russia campaigns to undermine the supply of Western weapons, as they do again today, let us instead be proud to stand resolutely with Ukraine in defence of their sovereignty and territorial integrity. The quickest path to peace is for President Putin to end his illegal invasion. We repeat our call for Russia to respect the UN Charter and to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. Thank you.
The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Today, we heard cynical statements along the lines of we would not be sitting here if Russia hadn't started this war. No, ladies and gentlemen, If we had not started our special military operation, tragedies like the one in Lysychansk would keep happening every day, which is exactly what was happening practically every day for 8 years up until 2022. Only you weren't noticing it back then, and we came to put an end to that war, and we most definitely will. To my UK colleague, I wish to say the following. It is your former Prime Minister Boris Johnson who in April 2022 came to Kiev in a rush when the agreement between Russia and Ukraine was practically ready and just had to be finalized. He rushed to Kiev and told his puppets in Kiev to continue the war against Russia. So it was your former Prime Minister Boris Johnson who is complicit in the crimes of the Kiev regime and who is responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of young Ukrainians on the battlefield, whereas their lives could have been spared if that agreement had been signed, if signing it had not been prohibited by your UK and US colleagues. To respond to the emotional statement made by the permanent representative of France, I would like to stress that deaths are always a tragedy. However, we are surprised by the cynical position of French colleagues when it comes to dividing civilians into those whose deaths and killings they condemn and those whose extermination they ignore. In being outraged by the deaths of their compatriots, the French representatives cynically ignore the fact that the weapons they ship is intentionally being used by the Kiev regime to kill civilians in Russian cities. Paris even tried to justify such crimes with the right to self-defense, essentially justifying acts of terrorism. We see the persistence with which French leadership refuses to recognize the fateful role that Paris, along with other Western capitals, played in 2014 when the crisis was erupting. They condoned the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev, which for 8 years was killing its own civilians, its own citizens in Donbass. France, whose former president admitted that the Minsk agreement were not meant to be implemented. Rather, they were just meant to create a pause in order for Kiev to rearm itself. So what can one say of the contribution that France is making today when it comes to maintaining the criminal band in Kiev, including supplying lethal weapons to Kiev and training Ukrainian soldiers? We have repeatedly said that France's growing involvement in the Ukraine conflict is not only drawing it out and leading to its further escalation, but it is threatening the lives of French citizens who, imbued with anti-Russian propaganda, are, with the tacit agreement of authorities, are going to the front lines to volunteer as mercenaries in the war. I hope that what has taken place will make the French public consider how justified the counterproductive and dangerous line its leadership is taking is in the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you.
Quite interesting, isn't it? So what I wanted to add to this is also that when the Japanese representative spoke, it's quite interesting. I think she didn't yet get the particular memo that the lingo has changed a little bit. You didn't see her in the video, but she ended her statement with, "We will support Ukraine for as long as it takes." It is now pretty clear in the US since a couple of weeks ago that the lingo now should be, "We will support Ukraine as long as we can." As President Biden expressed it, this is the defeat of Ukraine is becoming very obvious, and also the incapacity of the West to actually keep supplying arms because they don't have them, and even though money is now going dry, and that's another thing that Japan obviously has not entirely understood yet. And of course, the Japanese, they didn't supply weapons so far. They supplied humanitarian goods and so forth, which is a good thing, I think. But the nuances here are again seem to be lost on Japan. Or the official Japan, but the exchange also between the British and the French here with Russia are quite clear. It is very, very hypocritical of both of these powers, and the American representative was even more horrible, to keep coming back to this point that since everything is to blame on Russia, only Russia has the power to end everything and has to withdraw. This is really at this point a mantra that just then allows them to portray themselves as the heroic knights who support the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian representative who then spoke at the very end, who was also not in these clips, he obviously has to talk about Ukraine's grievances and how much death and destruction this war brought, which is true. It brought a horrible amount of death and destruction, which is why it should be ended as fast as possible. The Ukrainian representative also, like, showing his utter contempt for Russia, spoke, of course, in English, not in Russian, which is allowed in the Security Council. The languages of the great powers and Spanish and so on are official languages, but they choose not to use those. The point is that the Russians are not letting go of their diplomatic efforts to actually come to a negotiated end, and also keep signaling what they are willing to accept and what not. And the West keeps signaling that they're only willing to accept a complete, utter defeat of Russia, or like a complete withdrawal from all the territories, of course, which would include Crimea. And this is the impasse that we are at the moment. And even in the Security Council, this keeps playing out. The thing that gives me hope is that it actually is playing out in the Security Council, and that Russia is able to use the procedures of the UN, even if it's at this point just a talking shop, to continuously push for some form of negotiation, and also just keep bringing the atrocities up again and again. So this is the game that's currently going on. I do think, looking at the different diplomats here, the Russians definitely have the most skilled people, and I would hope that at some point, these people actually start with the real negotiations for a realistic end to the slaughter. Thank you.